The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering the floor-to-ceiling windows of Clara Monroe's rented condo in Miami's Brickell district. From the 12th floor, the city sprawled below like a neon-lit mirage, its skyscrapers blurred by the downpour into smears of electric blue and gold. Clara stood motionless, her reflection a faint ghost in the glass, a woman she barely recognized. Her chestnut hair, once meticulously styled to please her ex-husband, hung loose, damp from the humidity that seeped through even the tightest seals. Her hazel eyes, dulled by months of quiet grief, stared back, searching for a spark of the woman she used to be. Once, she had been Clara Davenport, wife of Julian Davenport, Miami's golden boy of luxury real estate. Now, she was just Clara, a name that felt both foreign and heavy, like a borrowed coat that no longer fit. 7 months had passed since the divorce papers were signed, a cold, legal amputation of a decade-long marriage. Julian had called it a mutual decision, a phrase as hollow as the champagne flutes they used to clink at charity galas, their smiles practiced for the cameras. But there was nothing mutual about the way he had dismantled her life. He had grown tired of her, he said, of her quiet introspection, her love for sketching seascapes in charcoal, her refusal to play the dazzling trophy wife he needed to seal multi-million-dollar deals. "You're not enough for this world, Clara," he had told her one evening, his voice sharp with impatience, his eyes already elsewhere. "I need someone who can keep up." That someone was Isabella Cortez, a former pageant queen turned influencer whose Instagram feed was a curated shrine to perfection. Her long, raven black hair and sculpted cheekbones graced billboards across South Beach, advertising swimwear and tequila with a sultry smile that promised a life Clara could never deliver. Julian had announced their engagement with a post that went viral. Isabella's manicured hand, adorned with a sapphire ring the size of a small island, resting on Julian's tan forearm. The caption read, "To New Horizons with My Forever." The post had garnered thousands of likes, each one a tiny dagger to Clara's heart. Not because she still loved Julian, for that love had withered long before the end, but because of the public erasure, the casual cruelty of being replaced without so much as a phone call. Clara's hand drifted to her abdomen, a reflex she hadn't yet learned to control. Beneath her oversized sweater was a gentle swell, a secret she had guarded fiercely since discovering it 3 weeks after Julian walked out. The pregnancy was a bittersweet accident, a reminder of a fleeting moment when they had tried to salvage something broken, a night of too much wine and desperate, unspoken sadness. Julian had always dismissed the idea of children, calling them a liability in this market. He wanted freedom, not roots. And now, here she was, tethered to him by a life he didn't even know existed, a life that was both a blessing and a terrifying weight. Her condo, a modest one-bedroom in a high-rise far from the oceanfront mansions she once called home, was a refuge. The walls were lined with sketchbooks, their pages filled with turbulent waves and storm clouds rendered in smudged charcoal, each stroke a release of the pain she couldn't voice. The furniture was second-hand, scuffed but comfortable, a stark contrast to the sleek, impersonal penthouse she had shared with Julian. That place had been a stage, every surface polished to reflect his success, every corner designed to impress. Here, the air smelled of graphite and chamomile tea, the only thing that eased her morning sickness. The settlement from the divorce, generous by Julian's lawyer's standards but calculated to keep her just above water, had paid for this space. It was enough to survive, but not enough to thrive in the glittering world Julian had taught her to navigate. Tonight was the Coral Gala, Miami's premier charity event, a glittering spectacle where the city's elite gathered to flaunt their wealth under the guise of philanthropy. Clara and Julian had attended every year of their marriage, their presence a carefully choreographed performance of power and charm. She knew Julian would be there tonight with Isabella, parading her like a prize, his arm around her waist, his smile a weapon. The thought sent a shiver through her, not of fear but of something sharper, more defiant. Her phone buzzed on the counter, an email from the gala organizers, her name still on the guest list, a forgotten relic of her past life. She had almost deleted it when a spark ignited in her chest, small but fierce, like the first ember of a fire that could consume a forest. Why should she hide? Why should she let Julian, rewrite her story, as if she had never existed. For years, he had controlled the narrative, the money, the friends, convincing her that her quiet strength was a weakness, that her love for art was a hobby, not a calling. But these 7 months alone had taught her otherwise. She had started sketching again, her charcoal capturing the raw power of the ocean, the fury of storms she had never dared express in his presence. She had reconnected with old friends, the ones who knew her before Julian, who saw her not as his accessory, but as Clara. And then there was the baby, this tiny life growing inside her, igniting a fierce protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. It wasn't just about her anymore. She had to be strong for them. Clara turned from the window and crossed to her closet, her steps deliberate. Hidden at the back, behind the muted blouses and practical dresses she had worn to appease Julian, was a garment bag. Inside was a dress she had bought impulsively during a solo trip to Barcelona, a deep sapphire gown with a plunging neckline and a skirt that flowed like the ocean at dusk, its silk shimmering with every movement. Julian had seen it once and scoffed, calling it too dramatic. "You'll draw the wrong kind of attention," he had said, his voice dripping with disdain. A slow, determined smile curved Clara's lips as she unzipped the bag, the sapphire fabric catching the dim light of her condo. "Perfect," she murmured to the empty room. She would go to the gala. She wouldn't make a scene or beg for attention. She would simply show up, a shadow stepping into the light, wearing her defiance like armor. She would carry her secret, the life growing inside her, as both a shield and a beacon. It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about reminding herself, and Julian, that she was still here, that she was more than the woman he had discarded. As she slipped into the dress, the silk cool against her skin, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The weariness was still there, etched in the faint lines around her eyes. But beneath it was something new, a flicker of defiance, a spark of the woman she was becoming. Tonight, she would make him see her, not as the timid wife he had erased, but as Clara Monroe, mother, artist, survivor. The Fontainebleau's grand ballroom was a cathedral of opulence, its chandeliers casting prisms of light across a sea of sequined gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air was thick with the scent of orchids and ambition, the low hum of calculated laughter mingling with the clink of crystal glasses. The Coral Gala was Miami's social apex, a night where fortunes were flaunted, alliances forged, and reputations made or broken over a single glance. For Julian Davenport, this was his kingdom, a stage where he shone brightest. He stood near the center of the room, his arm around Isabella Cortez, who glowed in a gold dress that hugged her curves like molten metal. The sapphire necklace at her throat, a gift from Julian that morning, sparkled with ostentatious clarity, its stones catching the light with every turn of her head. She was his masterpiece, a living testament to his success, a woman who turned heads and closed deals with a single smile. "Julian, darling," Isabella purred, her voice a practiced melody, her crimson-tipped fingers grazing his lapel. "You're distracted. Is someone stealing my spotlight?" He flashed a smile, his teeth gleaming under the chandeliers. "Never, Bella. Just making sure the room knows who's in charge." Julian was a man who thrived on control, every detail of his life a carefully curated exhibit. His navy Tom Ford tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his cufflinks glinting with subtle wealth. Tonight was the pinnacle of a year-long campaign to cement his place as Miami's untouchable real estate titan. The divorce from Clara, the quiet, unremarkable woman who had never fit his vision of grandeur, was a distant inconvenience, a chapter he had closed with a check and a signature. Isabella was his future, a dazzling upgrade that screamed success, her presence a signal to the world that he had moved on to bigger, better things. "Julian, there you are." A booming voice cut through the din. It was Victor Salazar, a rival developer whose approval Julian coveted. Victor's family had built half of Miami's skyline, their name synonymous with old money and unshakable influence. His nod carried weight, and Julian craved it. And Isabella, looking like a goddess. "You two are unstoppable." Isabella extended her hand, the sapphire ring catching the light like a beacon. "Julian has impeccable taste," she said, her eyes flicking to him with a possessive glint, a silent reminder of her value in his world. Victor chuckled, his gaze lingering on her a moment too long, a subtle challenge Julian chose to ignore. "Big night, Julian," Victor said, swirling his bourbon. "I hear you're closing in on the oceanfront tower deal. Word is, you're the man to beat." "We're in pole position," Julian replied, his voice smooth as polished granite, his confidence a well-rehearsed performance. The oceanfront tower was his white whale, a $2 billion project that would redefine Miami's skyline and etch his name into its history. Everything, his reputation, his relationship with Isabella, his empire, hinged on it. A single misstep could unravel years of calculated ambition, and Julian was not a man who tolerated missteps. The conversation shifted to zoning regulations and investor meetings, a language Julian spoke with predatory fluency. Isabella played her part flawlessly, nodding at the right moments, her smile never faltering, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of boredom. This world of power plays and deal-making was her ticket to a life of effortless luxury, but it was a means, not an end. She had clawed her way out of modest upbringing in Hialeah, her beauty and charm her currency, and Julian Davenport was her biggest score yet. She had no intention of losing him, not to a rival, not to a ghost from his past. As Julian held court, his mind wandered, unbidden, to Clara. He hadn't thought of her in months, not really. She was supposed to have faded away, a quiet ghost in a city that worshipped flash and noise. Their last interaction had been through lawyers, a sterile exchange of signatures and bank transfers. He had paid her to disappear, and she had, or so he thought. Yet, a nagging unease tugged at him, a loose thread in his otherwise perfect tapestry. He had expected her to crumble, to retreat into obscurity, but something about her absence felt too clean, too deliberate. He remembered her at last year's Coral Gala, standing by the dessert table in a simple ivory dress, elegant but understated, chatting with a bartender about his childhood in Havana. She had a way of connecting with people, a genuine warmth that Julian had once found charming but later dismissed as irrelevant. In his world, authenticity was a liability, not an asset. It didn't win contracts or impress investors. It didn't belong. "Everything okay, darling?" Isabella asked, her voice sharp, cutting through his thoughts like a blade. "You look like you're somewhere else. Just thinking about the deal," he lied, taking a sip of his bourbon, the burn grounding him. "It's a lot of pressure." "Well, you have me to take the edge off," she whispered, her hand sliding to his lower back, a gesture both intimate and territorial, a reminder that she was his partner in this carefully orchestrated life. Then the air shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd, starting near the entrance and spreading like wildfire across the ballroom. Heads turned, conversations faltered, glasses paused mid-sip. Julian felt it instantly, his senses honed to the social currents of the room, a predator attuned to the slightest shift in his territory. Someone important had arrived, someone who commanded attention without effort. He followed the gazes, his heart stopping as if struck by lightning. At the top of the grand staircase stood Clara Monroe. But this wasn't the Clara he knew. The timid, apologetic woman who had shrunk in his shadow was gone, replaced by a vision in sapphire. The gown clung to her curves, accentuating a fullness he didn't recognize, its silk shimmering like the ocean under moonlight. Her chestnut hair, once pulled back into a severe bun to please him, fell in soft waves over her shoulders, catching the chandelier light in a cascade of bronze. Her face, free of the heavy makeup he had insisted she wear, was radiant, her hazel eyes sharp and alive, burning with a quiet defiance. She was a force, a beacon in a room of muted elegance, her presence commanding the space in a way Julian had never allowed her to. Beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, was Rafael Navarro. Not Victor Salazar, the rival developer Julian could handle, but his uncle, the Rafael Navarro, a reclusive billionaire whose private equity firm funded half the world's luxury resorts, from Dubai to the Maldives. A man so powerful he could buy Miami's skyline and still have change left over. Rafael was a myth, a shadow who avoided the spotlight, his name spoken in hushed tones in boardrooms and private clubs. He didn't attend galas, didn't court the press, didn't play the social games that defined Julian's world. Yet here he was, escorting Clara, his presence a silent earthquake that shook the foundations of Julian's carefully constructed empire. Julian's world tilted, his breath catching in his throat. Clara, his forgotten ex-wife, wasn't just here. She was here with a man who could crush him with a single phone call, a man whose influence made Julian's ambitions look like child's play. The power dynamic he had wielded so ruthlessly in their marriage, the one that had kept Clara small and compliant, had just been inverted in the most public, devastating way possible. The whispers grew louder, the crowd's curiosity morphing into a frenzy of speculation. Who was she? Why was she with Rafael Navarro? What did this mean for Julian Davenport, the man who was supposed to be untouchable? Isabella's grip on his arm tightened, her crimson nails digging into his sleeve, drawing a faint sting. "Who is that?" she hissed, her voice venomous, her eyes narrowing as they raked over Clara's sapphire gown. Julian couldn't answer. He was frozen, his carefully constructed empire cracking under the weight of Clara's presence, her radiance, her alliance with a man who operated in a stratosphere Julian could only dream of reaching. Clara's heart pounded as she descended the marble staircase, each step a battle against the urge to flee. The crowd's stares were a physical weight, their whispers a chorus of judgment that threatened to drown her. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, every detail of her appearance, the sapphire gown, the loose waves of her hair, the curve of her belly, dissected and catalogued in the unforgiving hierarchy of Miami's elite. For a moment, the old Clara, the one who had spent years apologizing for existing, who had dimmed her light to fit Julian's vision, threatened to resurface, her knees trembling under the weight of the room's scrutiny. Her hand tightened on the ornate banister, her knuckles whitening against the cool marble. "Steady," a low voice said behind her, calm and grounding. "They're just curious. Let them look." She glanced over her shoulder at Rafael Navarro. His dark eyes, flecked with amber, held a calm assurance, a quiet strength that seemed to anchor the chaos around them. They had met just an hour ago, under circumstances so improbable they felt scripted by some cosmic playwright. Clara had arrived at the gala alone, her rideshare dropping her off a block away to avoid the chaos of limousines clogging Ocean Drive. The rain had soaked her shoes, the humid air clinging to her skin as she hurried toward the Fontainebleau's entrance, clutching her sketchbook for reasons she couldn't quite explain, a talisman of the woman she was trying to become. As she stepped onto the curb, her heel caught in a grate, and the sketchbook slipped from her bag, its pages fluttering onto the wet pavement like fallen leaves. Mortified, she had knelt to gather them, her hands shaking as the rain smudged her charcoal waves. A strong, tanned hand had appeared in her line of sight, picking up a sketch of a stormy ocean, the waves rendered in furious, jagged strokes. "This is remarkable," the voice had said, low and deliberate. "You capture the chaos beautifully." She had looked up into Rafael Navarro's face. He was older, perhaps in his early 50s, with a rugged elegance that stood in stark contrast to Julian's polished, gym-honed perfection. His dark hair was streaked with silver, his jaw lined with the faintest scars of a life lived boldly, perhaps from his days sailing the Caribbean, a rumor Clara had heard in passing. He wore a simple black suit, no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone, exuding a quiet confidence that didn't need a shout. His presence was magnetic, not because of flash, but because of a stillness that commanded respect. "Thank you," Clara had stammered, her cheeks burning with embarrassment as she took the sketch he offered. "Let me," he said, kneeling beside her to gather the rest of the pages with care. He didn't patronize her, didn't treat her like a damsel in distress. He handled her sketches as if they were treasures, his movements deliberate, respectful. When he handed her the sketchbook, their fingers brushed briefly, a spark of warmth cutting through the cold rain. "I'm Raphael," he said, his voice low and steady, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that was neither predatory nor pitying. "Clara," she replied, her voice barely audible over the rain. He studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing but not unkind, as if he could see past the sapphire gown and the nervous tremor in her hands to the heart of who she was. "You're headed to the Coral Gala," he said, not a question. She nodded, clutching the sketchbook to her chest. And you. A wry smile touched his lips, softening the lines around his eyes. I was avoiding it. These events are more my nephew's domain. But I owe Victor a favor. He paused, his eyes softening further, a hint of curiosity flickering in their depths. Why are you here, Clara? The question caught her off guard, direct and unadorned. She could have deflected, offered a polite lie about supporting the charity or networking, but something about him, his quiet intensity, his lack of pretense, demanded honesty. I'm here to prove I'm still alive, she said, the words spilling out with unexpected force, raw and unguarded. To remind myself that I exist. He nodded, a flicker of recognition in his amber-flecked eyes, as if he understood the weight of those words more deeply than she could know. A worthy mission, he said softly. No one should fight that battle alone. He offered his arm, a simple, chivalrous gesture that felt less like charity and more like an alliance. May I? It was absurd, a billionaire offering to escort a stranger he had met on a rainy curb. But it wasn't pity. It was a quiet pact between two people who didn't belong in this world of flash and facade, two outsiders stepping into the lion's den together. She hesitated, her mind flashing to Julian, to Isabella, to the inevitable confrontation. But the spark in her chest, that ember of defiance, flared brighter. She took his arm, her fingers resting lightly on the fine wool of his sleeve, and together they stepped into the Fontainebleau. Now, descending the staircase, Raphael's hand was a steady anchor on her back, his touch light but reassuring, a silent promise that she wasn't alone. The crowd parted before them, their whispers a buzzing undercurrent, a mix of awe and speculation. Clara felt Julian's stare, hot and furious, burning into her from across the room, but she didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead, her chin high, her sapphire gown a declaration of her presence, her refusal to be erased. The chandeliers above cast prisms across her dress, making her shimmer like a jewel in a room of muted tones. Your ex-husband, I take it, Raphael murmured, his voice low, meant for her ears alone. The one who looks like he's about to combust. That's him, she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Julian. And the woman trying to murder me with her eyes is his fiancée, Isabella. I see, Raphael said, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp, taking in the dynamics of the room with the precision of a man who had navigated far more dangerous waters than a Miami gala. He guided her toward the bar, his movements deliberate, creating a bubble of calm around them in the midst of the chaos. He ordered a ginger ale for her, intuiting her condition without a word, and a scotch for himself. Neat. He didn't try to fill the silence with small talk, didn't press her for explanations. He simply stood beside her, his presence a silent declaration of support, a shield against the prying eyes and whispered judgments. People began to approach, not the sycophants from Julian's circle who had once called Clara their friend, only to abandon her when the divorce was finalized, but a different caliber of guest. An art collector with a gallery in Wynwood, a tech entrepreneur who had just sold his startup for 9 figures, a philanthropist who ran a foundation for coastal conservation. Raphael introduced her simply as Clara, my friend, no qualifiers, no explanations, as if her presence needed no justification. With each introduction, she felt a piece of her old self, the artist, the dreamer, the woman who had once believed in her own worth, begin to resurface. She spoke of her sketches, her love for the ocean's untamed beauty, her travels to places like Barcelona and Santorini, places Julian had deemed irrelevant because they didn't advance his brand. The conversations flowed easily, her voice growing stronger with each word, her confidence a quiet rebellion against the years she had spent shrinking to fit Julian's world. She stole a glance across the room. Julian was still by the staircase, Isabella clinging to his arm like a lifeline, her gold dress a stark contrast to his navy tuxedo. His face was a mask of controlled rage, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear, a crack in his impenetrable facade. He was trapped, unable to confront her without acknowledging Raphael, unable to ignore her without looking weak in front of the world he had worked so hard to conquer. For the first time in their decade together, Clara held the power, and the realization sent a thrill through her, sharp and intoxicating. The ballroom buzzed with a new energy, the arrival of Clara and Rafael, shifting the social gravity of the room like a tide pulling at the shore. Julian felt the change acutely, his carefully curated world slipping from his grasp like sand through his fingers. He was no longer the center of attention, no longer the king holding court. The whispers were about Clara now, about her radiant presence, her sapphire gown, her connection to Rafael Navarro. Isabella's voice was a low hiss in his ear, her words dripping with venom. "What is she doing here? And who is that man?" "That's Rafael Navarro," Julian said, his voice tight, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. "He's untouchable." Isabella's eyes widened, her anger giving way to a flicker of fear and calculation. Rafael Navarro was a name whispered in boardrooms, a man who could make or break empires with a single decision, whose wealth and influence dwarfed even the most powerful players in Miami. Clara's presence on his arm wasn't just a personal slight. It was a threat to everything Julian had built, a crack in the foundation of his carefully constructed empire. Isabella understood power, had built her life on leveraging it, and she could see that the man with Clara possessed it in quantities she couldn't comprehend. "Do something," she demanded, her grip on his arm tightening, her nails biting into his skin through the fine wool of his tuxedo. "Go over there. Remind her who she is." "And say what?" Julian snapped, his composure fraying, his voice sharp with a rare edge of panic. "Excuse me, Mr. Navarro, one of the most influential men on the planet, but my ex-wife isn't supposed to exist anymore. Could you kindly return her to the obscurity I planned for her?" He knew he was outmatched, outmaneuvered in a game he hadn't even known he was playing. Every instinct screamed at him to reassert his dominance, to remind Clara of her place, to reclaim the narrative he had written for their lives. But one look at Raphael's calm, unreadable expression, those amber-flecked eyes that seemed to see through him, told him it would be a catastrophic mistake. This was a different league, a different game, and Julian didn't know the rules. Clara, meanwhile, felt a surge of confidence, a warmth spreading through her chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. Raphael's reputation was a shield, deflecting the petty judgments and malicious gossip she had feared would overwhelm her. People who had once ignored her, who had smiled politely at galas only to forget her name the moment Julian turned away, now sought her out, drawn by the mystery of her connection to Rafael. She spoke with the art collector about her love for charcoal's raw texture, with the philanthropist about the ocean's endangered ecosystems, with the entrepreneur about the freedom of creating without constraints. Each conversation chipped away at the shell Julian had built around her, revealing the woman she had been before him. Curious, passionate, alive. "Are you ready?" Raphael murmured, his voice a low rumble near her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "For what?" she asked, her pulse quickening, a mix of anticipation and dread. "To face him," he said, his eyes flicking toward Julian, who stood rigid across the room. "It's inevitable. Better to meet it on our terms than his." She took a deep breath, the air tasting of champagne and fear, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. He was right. Hiding in the corner, basking in the temporary safety of Raphael's presence, was a reprieve, not a resolution. The real test was coming, and she would not shrink from it. She gave him a small, determined nod, her hazel eyes meeting his with a resolve she hadn't felt in years. "On our terms." With a steadying hand on her back, Raphael began to walk, not away from Julian, but directly toward him, his pace slow and deliberate, like a ship cutting through a storm. The crowd parted before them, the ambient noise of the ballroom fading, as if the world had narrowed to this single, charged moment. It felt like a scene from a movie, a high-stakes showdown in the heart of enemy territory, the air crackling with tension. Clara's heart pounded, but she kept her chin high, her steps measured, her sapphire gown flowing around her like a wave. Julian saw them coming, and a primal rage surged through him, hot and possessive, a fire that threatened to consume the careful control he had spent years perfecting. This was his night, his fiancée, his world, and Clara was walking into it as if she had every right to be there, flanked by a man who made him feel small, insignificant. Isabella stiffened beside him, her gold dress glinting like armor, her eyes narrowing as she braced for the confrontation. They stopped a few feet away, a polite, civilized distance that felt like a chasm charged with electricity. The four of them stood in a silent tableau, the room holding its breath, waiting for the next move. It was Rafael who spoke first, his voice smooth and devoid of any discernible emotion, a calm that only amplified his authority. "Julian," he said, offering a nod of acknowledgement, as if they were old acquaintances meeting at a coffee shop, not rivals in a social coliseum. "Good to see you." "Rafael," Julian replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, his voice tight and strained, betraying the turmoil beneath his polished exterior. "I didn't expect you here." "A last-minute decision," Rafael said, his eyes flicking briefly to Clara before returning to Julian, a subtle gesture that carried the weight of a declaration. "Clara convinced me it was an event not to be missed." The words were a casual, devastating blow. "My friend Clara." Rafael hadn't called her Clara Davenport, hadn't tied her to Julian's name or legacy. He had claimed her as an equal, a friend, a person of value in her own right, erasing Julian's ownership of her with two simple words. The implication hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, a challenge to everything Julian had built. Julian's eyes finally met Clara's, searching for the woman he had known, the timid, compliant wife who had faded into the background of his life. He expected to see pain, anger, desperation, something he could exploit, something familiar. Instead, he saw a calm, quiet strength he didn't recognize, a woman who stood taller, brighter, than he had ever allowed her to be. The sapphire gown, the confident posture, the clear, steady gaze. It was all an accusation, a mirror reflecting his own failures. He had told himself she was weak, insignificant, a footnote in his story. But he had been wrong, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. Isabella, never one to be ignored, stepped forward, her smile as sharp as broken glass, her voice dripping with calculated venom. "Well, what a surprise," she said, her eyes raking over Clara with undisguised contempt, lingering on the sapphire gown, the soft waves of her hair, the curve of her belly. "I didn't realize you were still circulating, Clara." The insult was clear, a pointed reminder of Clara's supposed irrelevance, a jab meant to cut deep. Before Clara could respond, a wave of dizziness hit her, a familiar companion these past few months. The heat of the ballroom, the weight of the confrontation, the intensity of Julian's stare, it was all too much, pressing against her like a tide. She swayed slightly, her hand instinctively going to her stomach, a protective gesture to shield the life growing inside her. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but in the charged silence of that moment, it was a thunderclap, a revelation that echoed through the room. Julian saw it. His eyes, which had been burning with rage, suddenly widened in stunned disbelief, his gaze dropping from her face to her hand, resting on the gentle curve of her abdomen, a curve the sapphire gown could no longer fully conceal. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. 7 months since their divorce, 7 months since that reckless, wine-fueled night when they had tried to bridge the chasm between them, a night he had dismissed as a mistake and promptly forgotten. The blood drained from his face, his anger, his jealousy, his wounded pride, all of it evaporated, replaced by a single, cataclysmic realization. A baby. His baby. Isabella saw it too, her perfectly painted lips parting in a silent gasp, her eyes darting from Clara's hand to Julian's ashen face. A baby was a complication, a permanent, unbreakable link between Julian and the woman she had worked so hard to supplant. It was a threat to her carefully laid plans, a crack in the foundation of the life she had built with him. Her own world, so meticulously constructed, began to tilt, her composure fracturing under the weight of this new reality. Rafael, who had seen the gesture and understood its implication instantly, moved closer to Clara, his hand shifting to her arm, a firm, supportive presence. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. His stance was a declaration, a silent vow to protect her, to stand with her against the storm that was about to break. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, the room's attention fixed on the four of them, the air crackling with the weight of the unveiled truth. Clara looked at Julian, at the raw shock on his face, the dawning horror in his eyes. For the first time that night, she felt a flicker of pity for him. He had thought he was in control, the master of his universe, the architect of his own destiny. But in that single, silent moment, he had lost it all. He had discarded the most precious thing he ever had, and he hadn't even known it. She had come here tonight to remind him that she existed, to reclaim her place in a world that had tried to erase her. But she had done so much more. She had exposed his fragility, his loss, in front of the glittering elite he valued above all else. The fallout was quiet but seismic, a shift that rearranged the social landscape of the ballroom like tectonic plates grinding beneath the earth. The crowd had seen Julian's shock, Isabella's fury, Clara's gesture, and the pieces were clicking into place with devastating clarity. The gossip spread like a virus, fueled by the intoxicating combination of scandal, a surprise pregnancy, and the enigmatic presence of Rafael Navarro. Julian stood frozen, his empire crumbling under the weight of his own choices, his carefully constructed image as the untouchable titan shattering before the eyes of Miami's elite. Isabella's rage was a cold, sharp thing, her voice trembling as she turned on him, her words a venomous whisper meant for his ears alone. "You said it was over," she hissed, her gold dress glinting like a blade in the chandelier light. "You said she was nothing, Julian. A clean break. And now this." "I didn't know," he stammered, his mind reeling, his voice barely above a whisper. A child, a son or daughter, a piece of him growing inside the woman he had so callously discarded. The implications were staggering, not just a social inconvenience, but a fundamental reordering of his life, a truth he couldn't control or spin. "I didn't know," he repeated, more to himself than to her, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Isabella's laugh was a sharp, ugly sound, cutting through the hum of the crowd. "You didn't know? Were you that checked out, that incompetent?" The insult was designed to wound, and it hit its mark. Julian's entire identity was built on his competence, his control, his ability to anticipate and manipulate every variable in his world. To be caught unaware, to be blindsided by something as monumental as a child, was a failure he couldn't reconcile. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from face to face. The investors he had courted, the rivals he had outmaneuvered, the socialites who had fawned over him. They were all watching now, their expressions a mix of pity, curiosity, and a hint of schadenfreude. He saw Victor Salazar whispering to a colleague, his eyes glinting with opportunity, already calculating how to exploit Julian's sudden vulnerability. The oceanfront tower deal, the cornerstone of his legacy, felt suddenly precarious, a house of cards trembling in the wind. Clara and Rafael stepped onto the terrace, the cool night air a balm against her flushed skin, the distant sound of waves crashing against South Beach a soothing counterpoint to the frantic beating of her heart. Rafael led her to a secluded bench, shielded from the ballroom by a row of potted palms, their fronds swaying gently in the breeze. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, his amber eyes searching her face for signs of distress. "I think so," she said, taking a deep, shuddering breath, her hands still trembling from the intensity of the confrontation. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that. The reveal, it just happened. Sometimes the truth finds its own way out," Rafael said, his tone calm but weighted with understanding. "He didn't know about the baby." She shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips. "No, he made it very clear he didn't want a family. It would have complicated his brand, his ambitions. He wanted a legacy of steel and glass, not flesh and blood. His loss," Rafael said simply, but with a finality that resonated with truth. He took off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders, the fabric warm and smelling faintly of cedar and scotch. The gesture was so unexpectedly kind, so protective, that it made her throat tighten with emotion. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice thick, the question spilling out before she could stop it. "You don't even know me." Raphael leaned against the balustrade, his gaze fixed on the ocean, its waves glinting under the moon like a field of shattered glass. For a long moment, He was silent, the only sound the distant crash of the tide and the muffled hum of the ballroom behind them. "I've seen men like Julian before," he said finally, his voice low and hard, carrying the weight of old wounds. "Men who take, and take until there's nothing left. My sister, Elena, she worked for a man like him. A charismatic bully who used her talent, her spirit, to build his empire, then discarded her when she was no longer useful. He took credit for her ideas, chipped away at her confidence until she believed she was nothing. I couldn't save her." He paused, his jaw tightening, the memory still raw despite the years. "She walked away from her dreams, from herself. I lost her long before she died." The confession hung in the air between them, a moment of profound, shared vulnerability. Clara's heart ached for him, for the sister he had lost, for the pain that drove his quiet strength. "I'm so sorry, Rafael," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the waves. He turned to her, his amber eyes holding a flicker of old pain, but also a quiet resolve. "Don't be. Be strong. Be the woman Elena couldn't be. Live your life. Create your art. Raise your child. That's the best revenge you can have." Clara nodded, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. She understood now. Rafael wasn't just her ally. He was fighting a battle he had lost long ago, honoring his sister's memory by helping a stranger reclaim her life. In that moment, under the vast, star-dusted sky, she felt a connection to him, a quiet bond forged in shared pain and a mutual desire to defy the men who try to break them. In the days that followed, Clara's life took on a new rhythm, a quiet transformation that felt like waking from a long, restless sleep. The expected deluge of calls from gossiping acquaintances and prying reporters never came, as if an invisible shield had been erected around her. She knew, without being told, that it was Rafael's doing, his formidable influence working silently to protect her from the fallout of the gala. He called her the next morning. Not a text, but a proper phone call, his voice calm and steady, a reassuring anchor in the storm she had unleashed. "I trust you're recovering from last night's festivities," he said, a hint of dry humor in his tone. "Festivities isn't the word I'd use," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips as she sat on her couch, a mug of chamomile tea warming her hands. "But I'm okay. Thank you, Rafael, for everything." "It was my pleasure," he said, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "I have a proposition for you, Clara. I have a studio on my estate in Key Biscayne, a glass-walled space overlooking the ocean. It's quiet, private, with perfect light for painting. I thought you might like to use it for a while, to get away from the city, to work, to breathe." The offer was overwhelming, a gesture so generous it felt like something out of a fairy tale, a billionaire offering her a sanctuary on his private estate. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her mind racing. "That's too much." "Nonsense," he said firmly, but with a kindness that softened the edges of his words. "The studio is empty, and frankly, I'd enjoy the company. The estate is large. You wouldn't have to see me at all if you didn't wish to. Think of it as an artist's residency. No strings attached." She knew she should refuse, that accepting such an offer was too great an imposition, too tangled with implications. But the thought of escaping Miami's noise, its ghosts, its relentless social churn, was an irresistible siren call. The idea of a quiet space to paint, to prepare for her child, to rebuild herself, it was everything she needed. "Okay," she said softly, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Yes, I'd like that very much." 2 days later, a discreet black car arrived to take her and her few belongings to Key Biscayne. The estate was a sprawling expanse of manicured gardens, ancient banyan trees, and private beaches, a world apart from the frenetic energy of Brickell. The main house was a modern marvel of glass and stone, but the car bypassed it, following a winding path to a secluded corner of the property. The studio was a glass-walled pavilion perched on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, its clean lines and open space designed to capture the light at every hour of the day. Inside, it was furnished with a large easel, a worn leather couch, and a small kitchen stocked with essentials. A bedroom with a view of the ocean completed the space, its simplicity a perfect canvas for her new beginning. For the first week, Clara saw no one. She painted with a fervor she hadn't felt in years, her charcoal sketches evolving into bold, vibrant oils that capture the ocean's raw power. Crashing waves, stormy skies, the interplay of light and shadow. She walked along the private beach, the sand cool beneath her feet, the rhythm of the tide soothing her nerves. She napped in the afternoon sun, cooked simple meals, and felt the weariness in her bones begin to dissipate, replaced by a burgeoning sense of peace. The city, with its noise and its ghosts, felt a million miles away. Rafael, true to his word, respected her privacy. But he left small gifts on the studio's doorstep, a basket of mangoes from his orchard, a collection of poetry by Pablo Neruda, a rare jasmine tea he thought she might enjoy. Each gesture was thoughtful, unobtrusive, a quiet affirmation of her worth without demanding anything in return. One evening, as she watched the sunset paint the ocean in hues of coral and violet, he appeared, walking slowly down the path from the main house, his hands in his pockets, his presence unassuming but steady. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, stopping a polite distance away, his voice carrying over the gentle crash of the waves. "Not at all," she said, gesturing to a wooden bench on the studio's patio. "Please." He sat, a comfortable silence settling between them as they watched the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon. The air was warm, scented with salt and jasmine, and for the first time in months, Clara felt truly at ease. "I heard from my nephew today," Rafael said finally, his voice casual but deliberate. "It seems Julian Davenport is having some trouble with his oceanfront tower project." Clara's heart gave a small flutter, a mix of curiosity and trepidation. "Oh, the primary investors are getting cold feet," he continued, his gaze fixed on the darkening water. "They're concerned about his personal stability. A messy public divorce, a surprise pregnancy, and the perception that he's made a powerful enemy. It's not good for business." He said it without a trace of gloating, a simple statement of fact, but the implications were clear. "Is that enemy you?" she asked quietly, her eyes searching his face. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the twilight. "I haven't made a single phone call, Clara. I haven't had to. Men like Julian build their empires on perception, on the illusion of invincibility. All I did was show up and crack the facade. The rest is just gravity." She believed him. His power wasn't in overt action, but in his very existence, a standard against which men like Julian were measured and found wanting. "He's called me," she confessed, the words tasting bitter. "Twice. I didn't answer. What do you think he wants?" Rafael asked, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp, inviting her to unpack her thoughts. "I don't know," she said honestly, her hands resting on her belly, feeling the faint flutter of movement beneath her skin. "To yell at me? To demand a paternity test? To try to control this the way he controlled everything else? I can't imagine any scenario that isn't about him, about what he needs, what he wants to own." "And what do you want?" he asked, the question simple but profound, cutting through the noise of her fears. She looked down at her hands, at the curve of her belly, at the ocean stretching endlessly before them. "I want to have this baby," she said, her voice firm, the uncertainty falling away like dead leaves. "I want to raise him or her in a world that's safe and calm and full of love. I want to paint, to create, to build a life that's mine, not an extension of someone else's." "That sounds like a good plan," Rafael said, his voice warm with approval, a quiet pride that made her chest ache with gratitude. They sat in silence again, but it was a silence filled with understanding, a connection deeper than words. This was more than a friendship, more than an alliance of convenience. It was a bond forged in shared pain, in a quiet rebellion against a world that valued power over humanity. "Rafael," she said, turning to him, her voice soft but steady. "Your sister, you said she was talented. Did she have a name?" A sad, small smile touched his lips, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Her name was Elena Navarro," he said, "and she would have liked you very much." In that moment, under the vast, star-dusted sky, Clara felt the last of her old fears fall away. She was no longer a victim of Julian's story, no longer defined by his rejection. She was the author of her own narrative, and Rafael, this quiet, wounded man, was the first character in her new chapter. Julian Davenport was a man adrift, his life unraveling like a poorly stitched seam. The oceanfront tower deal, the one that was meant to be his coronation, his legacy etched in Miami's skyline, had collapsed. The investors, spooked by the public spectacle at the gala, had pulled out, citing vague market concerns that were a thinly veiled reference to his personal instability. His name, once synonymous with Midas-like success, was now whispered in tones of pity and contempt in the boardrooms and yacht clubs he frequented. Isabella, his fiery, ambitious fiancée, had become a creature of cold, simmering rage, her dreams of effortless luxury tarnished by the scandal. The sapphire ring on her finger, once a symbol of their shared triumph, felt like a consolation prize for a deal gone sour. Their penthouse, a glass and chrome monument to their power, now felt like a gilded cage, the silence between them thick with unspoken accusations. Isabella spent her days scrolling through social media, her posts less frequent, her smile less convincing. The gossip columns, once her allies, now speculated about their strained relationship, their amicable split looming on the horizon. But it wasn't the loss of the deal or Isabella's fury that haunted Julian's sleepless nights. It was the image of Clara in that sapphire gown, her hand on her belly, her eyes steady and unafraid. His child, a life he had created and abandoned without a thought, a truth that had shattered his world in a single moment. He had tried to rationalize it, to frame the pregnancy as a problem to be managed, a variable to be controlled. He had his lawyers draft letters, demand paternity tests, offer settlements to keep the situation quiet. But Clara had refused to engage. His calls went to voicemail, his emails unanswered. His lawyers met with a polite but impenetrable wall of silence from a legal team he soon discovered was being paid by Rafael Navarro. The lack of control was driving him mad. He, Julian Davenport, who had orchestrated every aspect of his life with ruthless precision, was now powerless, shut out of the most important event of his life. Desperation clawed at him, a raw, unfamiliar emotion that gnawed at his carefully constructed identity. He had to see her, to talk to her, to understand, to do something, anything, to reclaim a piece of what he had lost. The motives were a tangled mess in his head, a toxic cocktail of ego, regret, and a strange, nascent flicker of paternal instinct. He found out where she was from a disgruntled former groundskeeper at Raphael's estate, a man who traded information for a thick envelope of cash. The knowledge that Clara was living under Raphael's protection, in a studio on his pristine Key Biscayne property, was another dagger to his already wounded pride. He drove to the estate on a gray, drizzly afternoon, the weather a perfect match for his mood. He didn't have a plan, operating on pure, unadulterated impulse, a way of being he had long ago disdained in others as weak, undisciplined. He bypassed the main gate, parking his car on a side road and cutting through the dense mangroves, feeling like a common trespasser, his Italian loafers sinking into the mud. The studio came into view, a glass-walled pavilion perched on a bluff, its clean lines glowing in the dim light. A plume of smoke curled from a small chimney, a sign of life that felt like a personal affront. Through the large window, he saw her. Clara stood at an easel, her back to him, completely absorbed in her work. She wore a paint-smeared smock, her chestnut hair tied up loosely, strands escaping to frame her face. Her belly was a prominent, perfect curve under the fabric, a testament to the life growing inside her. She was beautiful, more beautiful than he had ever seen her, radiating a peace, a self-contained serenity that he had stripped from her, that she had somehow reclaimed without him. He watched her for a long time, a storm of conflicting emotions raging within him, regret, anger, longing, shame. He saw the woman he had married, the quiet, gentle soul he had once loved before his ambition had poisoned everything. He saw the woman he had broken, and the woman who had risen from the ashes, stronger, brighter, untouchable. Finally, he stepped out of the mangroves and onto the gravel path, the crunch of his shoes breaking the silence. Clara turned, her eyes widening, not with fear, but with a weary, profound disappointment, as if she had been expecting this moment, this final, desperate act. She didn't invite him in. She stepped onto the porch, pulling her smock tighter around her, a protective gesture that spoke volumes. "Julian," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the warmth he had once taken for granted. "You shouldn't be here." "I had to see you, Clara," he said, his voice raw, pleading, a tone he barely recognized as his own. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," she said, her calmness more unnerving than any anger would have been. "You made your choices. I'm making mine. Our child is not a choice you get to make alone." He burst out, the words raw and possessive, a last grasp at control. "That's my baby too." A sad, knowing smile touched her lips, her hazel eyes holding his with a clarity that made him flinch. "Is it? You didn't want a baby, Julian. You wanted a dynasty, a legacy of towers and headlines. But a legacy isn't a building with your name on it. It's a person, and you didn't want a person. You wanted an idea." Her words were like razors, stripping away his self-delusions, laying bare his pathetic motives. "I made a mistake," he whispered, the admission costing him everything, his voice breaking under the weight of his own failure. "A terrible mistake." "Yes, you did," she agreed, her voice still quiet but now with a core of steel, unyielding and absolute. "You made a mistake when you decided my love was a liability. You made a mistake when you thought you could discard me like a piece of old furniture. And you made a mistake when you thought your money could fix everything." She took a step closer, and for the first time, he saw not just strength in her eyes, but a deep, unbridgeable chasm of pity. "You don't get to do this, Julian. You don't get to wreck my life and then show up when you're lonely and demand to be a part of the one good thing that came out of the wreckage. This baby deserves better than that. This baby deserves a father, not a landlord." Every word was a nail in the coffin of his old self, each syllable a judgment he couldn't escape. He had come here for a reckoning, expecting to set terms, to reclaim some measure of control. Instead, he was the one being judged, and he was being found wanting. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice breaking, his hands trembling at his sides. "Money? A contract? Name it." "I want you to leave," she said simply, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. "I want you to go back to your life, to Isabella, to your glass penthouse. I want you to leave us alone. That's all I've ever wanted." Before he could respond, another figure appeared, walking down the path from the main house. Rafael Navarro, his presence as calm and immovable as the ocean itself. He wasn't hurrying, wasn't angry, just present, his dark suit blending into the twilight. He stopped beside Clara, placing a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of quiet, solid support. He looked at Julian, his amber eyes holding no malice, only a final, profound dismissal. Julian looked from Clara's resolute face to Raphael's protective stance, seeing the bond between them, the quiet alliance that had formed in the wake of his betrayal. He saw the life they were building here, a life of peace and art and genuine affection, a life that had no room for him. He had lost, not just the deal, not just the respect of his peers, but the woman he had never truly appreciated and the child he would never know. The realization was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs, bringing him to his knees on the damp gravel path. This was his reckoning, not a fight or a negotiation, but a quiet, devastating moment of clarity. He was the ghost now, the irrelevant figure from a past that had moved on without him. He looked up at Clara, at the woman he had wronged, the mother of his child, and in her eyes he saw not hatred but a final, heartbreaking release. She was free of him, and he was utterly, irrevocably alone. 6 months later, the first rain of the season fell softly over Key Biscayne, a gentle drizzle that misted the air and clung to the leaves of the banyan trees. From the large window of her studio, now officially her home, Clara Monroe watched the droplets trace paths down the glass, her newborn daughter, Lila, sleeping soundly in her arms. Lila was perfect, with her mother's quiet nature, and, Clara had to admit, a shock of dark hair that was pure Julian. But looking at her daughter, Clara felt no bitterness, only a profound, overwhelming love that filled every corner of her heart. The studio had become her world, a sanctuary of creation and new life. The walls were covered with her canvases, vibrant oil paintings of ocean storms and sunlit horizons, each one pulsing with a life of its own. A gallery in Wynwood, owned by a friend of Raphael's, had seen her work and offered her a solo show, her first. The artist's residency had become a career, a testament to the woman she had rediscovered within herself. Her paintings were more than art. They were a declaration of her survival, her resilience, her refusal to be erased. Her relationship with Raphael had blossomed in the quiet, unhurried way of things meant to last. It was not a fiery, passionate affair, but a deep, steady companionship built on mutual respect and shared vulnerabilities. He was a constant, gentle presence in her and Lila's life, reading poetry to the baby in his low, soothing voice, claiming it was never too early to appreciate Neruda. He would sit for hours in her studio, watching her paint, content to simply be in her presence, his amber eyes warm with pride. He was not trying to replace Lila's father. He was simply being Raphael, a kind, decent man who had stepped into a void and filled it with quiet strength. They were a family, not a conventional one, but a real one, forged in the crucible of betrayal and rebuilt on a foundation of trust. One afternoon, a package arrived, a flat wooden crate with no return address, only a Miami postmark. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper, was a painting, a small, exquisite seascape by John Singer Sargent, one of Clara's favorite artists, its waves rendered with a luminous clarity that took her breath away. Tucked into the corner of the frame was a handwritten note, the script unmistakably Julian's. Clara, there are no words to undo what I did. I know there is no excuse for my blindness, my cruelty. I have spent the last 6 months learning the true meaning of the word bankrupt, and it has nothing to do with money. I saw the announcement of your show. Congratulations. I'm not surprised. I always knew you were brilliant. I was just too arrogant to admit it. This is not a gift to buy forgiveness. That is not for sale. Think of it as a small, inadequate apology, a down payment on a debt I can never repay. I will not bother you again. I have signed all the necessary papers. My lawyers will arrange for child support to be placed in a trust you alone will control. Lila deserves everything. I hope she has your heart. It was always the best part of you. Julian. Clara read the note twice, her hand trembling slightly, the words stirring a complex mix of emotions. Pity, closure, a faint echo of the pain she had carried for so long. It was the first time she had heard from him since that day on the gravel path, and the words were stripped of his usual bluster, his arrogance replaced by something that sounded like genuine remorse. She looked at the painting, its waves a quiet reflection of her own journey, and felt a sense of peace. It was a peace offering, an admission of everything he had lost. She showed the note to Raphael that evening as they sat by the studio's fireplace, Lila gurgling softly in her bassinet. He read it, his expression thoughtful, his fingers tracing the edge of the paper. It seems the man is capable of learning, he said quietly, handing it back to her. What do I do? She asked, her voice soft and certain. You do whatever feels right to you, he said, taking her hand, his touch warm and steady. His journey is his own now. It no longer has to intersect with yours unless you choose it. She thought about it for a long time, her eyes drifting to Lila, to the painting, to the life she had built. The old Clara would have been consumed by the gesture, by the lingering connection to Julian, but she was not that woman anymore. She walked to the bassinet and looked down at her daughter, her future embodied in those tiny, perfect features. Her life was here, in the smell of baby powder and turpentine, in the warmth of Raphael's hand, in the steady rhythm of her own heart. She would not write back. She would not reject the gift. She would simply accept it for what it was, a final, closing chapter of a book she was no longer reading. She hung the painting in Lila's room, a quiet reminder that even out of great pain, something beautiful could grow. On the opening night of her gallery show in Wynwood, the room was packed, the air humming with excitement. Clara's paintings glowed under the gallery's soft lights, their vibrant seascapes drawing gasps and murmurs from critics and collectors alike. She stood in the center of it all, Lila strapped to her chest in a soft carrier, Raphael by her side, his pride in her radiating like a physical warmth. The show was a triumph, her work selling faster than the gallery owner had anticipated, her name whispered with a reverence she had never known. Across the room, near the exit, a man stood in the shadows, half hidden by a concrete pillar. It was Julian. He looked thinner, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on his frame, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there before. He was alone, the gossip columns having reported his amicable split with Isabella weeks ago. He wasn't looking at the paintings. He was looking at Clara, at Lila, at Rafael, at the life he had thrown away. Their eyes met for a brief, fleeting moment across the crowded room, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a concession to her victory, to his defeat. Then he turned and slipped out into the Miami night, a ghost finally accepting his place in the past. Clara felt a sense of release, a final severing of the cord that had tethered her to him. She turned to Rafael, a bright, genuine smile illuminating her face. "I think I'm ready for a glass of sparkling water," she said, her voice light-free. He smiled back, his amber eyes full of a love that was as quiet and deep as the ocean they both cherished. "I think you've earned it," he said, handing her a glass. She looked around the room, at her art, at the life she had built from the ashes of betrayal. She had faced a man who had tried to erase her, endured a power imbalance that had kept her small, and discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had found redemption, not in revenge, but in creation, in love, in the limitless colors of her own canvas. And as she stood there, with Lila's warmth against her chest and Raphael's steady presence at her side, she knew she had found a wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars or square footage, a wealth of peace, of purpose, of a life that was wholly, gloriously her own.